Band, Genesis. Album, Nursery Crime. Songs on the album. Side 1, track 1st. The Musical Box, track 2nd. For Absent Friends, track 3rd. The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Side 2, track 1st. Seven Stones, track 2nd. Harold the Barrel, track 3rd. Harlequin, track 4th. The Fountain of Salmachus. Released November 12, 1971. Studio, Trident Studios, London. Recorded August 1971. Personnel, Genesis, Tony Banks, Hammond organ, Mellotron, acoustic piano, electric piano, 12-string guitar, backing vocals. Mike Rutherford, bass pedals, 12-string guitar, backing vocals. Peter Gabriel, lead vocals, flute, oboe, bass drum, tambourine. Steve Hackett, electric guitar, 12-string guitar. Phil Collins, drums, percussion, backing vocals, lead vocal on For Absent Friends, uncredited. Engineer, David Henschel. Producer, John Anthony. Artwork, Paul Whitehead. Inspired by The Musical Box. Label, Charisma.
The making of the album, Nursery Crime. After Trespass, chaos reigned for Genesis. Getting over the departure of Anthony Phillips would prove to be the most arduous test in the history of the band, which, as already mentioned, had also decided to change its drummer. To focus on fresh material and tackle the new challenges posed by live performances, as soon as Philip David Charles Collins, born in Chiswick, January 30th, 1951, had been welcomed into the fold, Genesis threw themselves into a long period of rehearsals, working as a four-piece at the Maltings, Farnham. Collins. We were like two worlds colliding. It's extraordinary that we got along so well, because at the beginning, we were from totally different backgrounds. I was a grammar school boy, actually, and I had just finished 2 or 3 years in drama school, where anything went. I went out with all the girls, whereas they'd come from public school, where there were no girls. I was very lighthearted and jokey and fully comfortable on stage, even though I was behind the drums, whereas they all seemed quite uptight. Part of that was because Anthony had just left and they didn't really know what was going to happen. He was a quarter of their songwriting team. Sometimes we'd be playing, and suddenly something would happen, and there'd only be 3 of us left because either Mike or Tony had stormed off. Something had been said by somebody, and I hadn't even noticed. A couple of hours later, they'd come back. There was a lot of tension. It took a long time to get used to, and a long time for it to disappear slightly. During this time, songs like Wooden Mask and Moss were written, while other material dating back to when Phillips was still in the band was Perfected Fountain of Salmachus. Rehearsals at the Maltings went on for 3 weeks in September 1970. Then, after a handful of shows, the band were back in the rehearsal rooms in mid-October, this time with new guitarist Mick Barnard, born in Aylesbury, March 5, 1948, who, despite writing most of the guitar solo for The Musical Box, never really managed to get into the spirit of Genesis. Banks. We found the drummer quite quickly and quite easily. I mean, Phil was a fantastic find. But the guitarist was more of a problem. In fact, we went out as a 4-piece for about 2 or 3 months. This taught me a lot because I ended up playing all Ant's guitar parts on the piano through a fuzz box, all the ones I could anyhow, while at the same time playing the organ part. So suddenly I was doing this two-handed stuff which I'd never really done before. We started writing this piece, which became The Musical Box, as a 4-piece. We had a guitarist very briefly for a month or 2 called Mick Barnard. He was actually good. He probably just wasn't assertive enough. They finally found the man who would become the band's full-time guitarist towards the end of the year. A member of Quiet World, and with an album already under his belt, The Road, Stephen Richard Hackett, born in London, February 12, 1950, joined Genesis, after Barnard was fired on January 5, 1971, and made his first stage appearance with the band on the 14th of that month. Banks. Mike was always looking for someone to replace Ant, which he was never going to be able to do because he was a good friend and everything. So Peter and I went and auditioned Steve, and we were really impressed with him. We really liked the way he approached things. His brother John was on the flute, and he was playing these things on guitar which were slightly more classical than we were used to, but we thought he had a lot of imaginative ideas. He didn't want to be a mad guitarist. Most guitarists either wanted to be on lead guitar playing solos or else they were just purely acoustic guitarists, and we wanted someone who could cover both roles. So Steve was a very important addition. Hackett. Phil had been to stage school, and I'd been a grammar school boy. There was a mixture from my background. Some people were posh, some people weren't. I think my school was maybe more of a level playing field. The new arrivals, without a doubt, took the already high technical standard of the band up a notch. Collins was already a superb drummer and probably the most instinctive musician of the five. As well as being gifted with a great voice, Collins also turned out to be a talented arranger, as well as the band member with the most outgoing character, in sharp contrast to the rather more reserved nature of the ex-Charterhouse boys. Hackett, on the other hand, despite being less able than Phillips on the 12-string, possessed superior technical skills on electric guitar and as a soloist. Furthermore, he also had a predisposition towards experimentation, something which would improve the overall quality of Genesis music. Rutherford. Whereas it took Steve a little while to become what he is on drums, Phil was immediately a huge lift. We had never had that kind of energy from the engine room before. It was just a whole different level. Gabriel. Phil can get on with anyone, although on occasions I think it was an alien world to him, whereas Steve is more of a loner, I think, in terms of personality. I think I get on with most people fairly easily, but Tony doesn't. Nowadays, he's a whole lot different, much more mellow and open, but it took him a long time to open up to Steve. The same goes for Mike, to some extent, but less so because Mike had moved into guitar territory, and so they were two guitarists working together. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway period was a more difficult and darker time. The arguments were more about life issues, whereas on Nursery Crime we only had musical differences. Hackett. It was a little bit hard to understand them when I first joined. They'd been at school together for all those years, all talking the same sort of language. It was almost as if the band had its own way of communicating, the equivalent of Cockney rhyming slang. They used expressions I'd never heard before, and some fairly deep-seated issues went back to their school days, which obviously Phil and I weren't privy to. I think it was tougher for them, because there was a lot of affection for the guys who'd been through the ranks previously, people like Anthony Phillips, whom I got to meet subsequently. I realized that had we all been in the band together at the same time, we probably would have enjoyed working together. Collins. We rehearsed at the Maltings in Farnham, where Mike and his parents lived. And I stayed with them while we wrote what would become Nursery Crime. We wrote the musical box there.
When they wanted the Maltings back, we moved to Tony Stratton Smith's country residence, Luxford House, in Crowborough in Sussex. That was fantastic, it was lovely, and we rehearsed in the garage or the barn. We wrote The Return of the Giant Hogweed there, and Steve wrote For Absent Friends. Luxford House is a somewhat eerie-looking 16th-century Tudor house. It was here that Genesis were aiming to give their new album a more definite form, something which turned out to be easier said than done. Hackett. We wrote it over the course of one summer in 1971. I think it took about 3 months, but it was recorded rather more quickly, in about a month. We stopped doing gigs because the new band, which is with Phil and me, did try and write on the road, but I think everyone was just too stressed traveling around everywhere that we couldn't really write as a team. We needed time off to really get to know each other, work together, and relax. Rutherford. I remember the sessions being quite hard. Steve and Phil had just joined the band, so we had these 2 new members on board. I mean, it had all changed, sonically, and as players, we were improving a lot, but writing some of the songs wasn't easy, although some of them are really strong. Hackett. I was the only person in the band who didn't have a girlfriend. They probably thought I was gay, but the truth is, I had given up on romance to really concentrate on music, and all my time was spent on that. So it was quite an emotional time for me as I couldn't really put my arms around anyone at the end of the day. It was hard, but it was wonderful as well. We stayed in this place, which was called a cottage but was, in fact, a large house. For me, it was like a manor house compared to anything I had known. I had my own room and the English summer and all that beautiful music. We used to sit out on the grass, because it was such a glorious summer, playing 12-string together, writing and performing. I remember sitting out there playing for Absent Friends and Harlequin for John Anthony. We were like country boys. This was all new to me because I was from the city. I was from Pimlico, near Battersea Power Station, the one on the Pink Floyd album cover, Animals. It was the fulfillment of a dream, working with a mellotron and a band that was capable of sounding like an orchestra, a choir, a rock band, and a pantomime troupe because of the humor. It was many things, and it filled a very big void in my life at the time. Collins, I have very fond memories of the period. We were a really great five-piece working unit. I mean, we all got together for the meetings about the cover, and we were all pretty much involved in the writing, apart from the lyrics, which were written in pairs. Of course, there were still some heated arguments between the three founding members of the band. Hackett, we just let them get on with it, knowing that soon all would be forgiven. I think we were just dead serious about getting things right. Peter Gabriel and his wife Jill in Genoa on August 22, 1972. It was extraordinary how it could go from a blazing row 1 minute to someone sitting down playing the most exquisite, gentle music the next. I think they wanted people who were ambitious about their music rather than, the idea of having hit singles. In those days, the band really didn't get any radio support. There was only the BBC, and we weren't really a singles band, we were firmly set on albums. And that was great for me because I liked the idea of long songs that developed. The album was mainly recorded in August at Trident Studios in London. Although they hadn't done much in terms of writing, Steve and Phil's presence in the band proved decisive in other ways. Banks, Phil and Steve's contribution, particularly at this stage, was to bring a bit of musicianship into the group. As musicians, Mike and I were still learning. Phil came, and he was a really high-quality drummer right from the word go, with a great sense of rhythm, and Steve was obviously technically a better player than we were at that time. That gave us the ability to have a bit of technique in there as well as everything else, which gave us a better chance to do things. The contribution from Phil on drums is what transformed it, really. The rhythm section was a bit stiff on Trespass, whereas those complicated songs like The Return of the Giant Hogweed have a much better flow about them. And Phil's other contribution, which we were aware of right from the start, was the fact that he could sing. The rest of us made vague attempts at doing backing harmonies, which were okay, but with Phil, we actually had someone with a really strong voice. He and Pete used to do a lot of singing in unison, and Phil was also very good at just picking out little harmonies, a bit like Crosby, Stills and Nash. Hackett, if I were to talk about the differences between myself and Phil, I'd say his was more of a jazz lover's approach, whereas I love classical music and blues. There was a kind of natural fusion of lots of elements that the band had. Tony liked classical music too, he liked hymns, and I liked those chord shapes, those harmonic inversions. Then, Phil had me listening to Buddy Rich and Mel Torme, which sounded strange to me at first, but I realized that that was where he got the basis for all those accents he was putting in. We sort of learned off each other, and then during the course of Nursery Crime, I'd come up with this idea of a guitar technique called tapping, which meant you could play the fretboard like a keyboard and then Tony and I would do harmony duets. Gabriel, each person in the band had his own little corner of songwriting that they'd sometimes do on their own, and there'd be this bigger area which was the band, and because we were the old-timers, Tony, Mike, and we got more airtime in those days. In the band, there was this sort of dark, contained personality that was struggling to get out, and I think that's partly why we connected with people. There was this compressed energy that needed to explode. We didn't always manage to get it out, but people could feel and touch the vibrations humming beneath the surface. Steve definitely had a good dollop of unfulfilled frustrations that gave the band a good personality. The production was once again in the hands of John Anthony and his young assistant engineer, Dave Henschel. Hackett, I liked John very much, but it was Dave Henschel who was the engineer. We tried to do the songs all in one go, and the same with the mixing. No one was editing, no one was experienced enough to do that. Sometimes we worked very late at night, and people would get very tired. If there was a mistake, you had to go right back to the beginning. Editing was a razor blade slicing the tape, so it was laboriously slow to mix. Had we been more experienced, who knows how it would have sounded. But there was a lot of passion and instinct going on. Intelligence would only be employed later. Collins, I found I couldn't really listen to the old albums. I just didn't like the sound. It didn't sound as good as it had in the rehearsal room. I used to put everything on a cassette, later on DAT, and I'd play them in the car on the way home, wondering what happened, why things hadn't come out as good on the record. But, of course, it's just that bit of roughness. The compression of the cassette player and nerves in the studio. Without a doubt, we were working against the clock. Of course, we weren't the ones putting the fingers on the buttons, that was John Anthony and the sound engineer. My real frustration was that we all used to go into the studio and play the song that we had rehearsed or taken out on the road. The drummer's first takes are usually the best, first, second, third, possibly, after that he's playing safe because he doesn't want to fuck it up. I think we once got to take 31 or something and I said, enough. And then we had this wonderful moment when Tony said, right, well I'll go and replace my keyboards, and Mike said he wanted to replace his guitar and a bass as well. I was the only one who was stuck with my part, which probably was actually better 3 hours before. There was a lot of that in those early albums. Nowadays, of course, it's all different. On the last album we did together, We Can't Dance, 1991, we just put a skeleton track down and then went in to replace everything. But back in the old days, we tried to play it as a band. Hackett, I was very intense about the band. I probably didn't have much of a sense of humor at the time. I just kept asking the sound engineer, Dave Henschel, or John Anthony, how we could make it better all the time. We worked long hours, but it was probably recorded in about a month at Trident Studios in Soho. I was thrilled with it, you know. I refused to hear the rough edges at the time. I just wanted to bask in the glory of the fact that I'd done an album with what was destined to become a great band. Occasionally, the sound was wonderful, and that was great for me. I think the new mixes have improved things sonically, also because everyone's had decades to reflect on how things could be improved. They could have gone further with the new mixes, of course, in terms of the timing and tuning. As it is, it's still preserved pretty much as it was. It's almost as if it's just had a bit of a dusting rather than a total facelift.
The album, Nursery Crime, was perhaps the most difficult album for the band to write. Having started with the intention of becoming a team of writers, Genesis suddenly found themselves without Anthony Phillips, the leading light of the songwriting process. Despite the obvious progress over the pop songs put together for From Genesis to Revelation on Trespass, the Banks-Gabriel writing input was clearly weaker than that of Phillips. Moreover, Rutherford had not yet shown any great talent as a songwriter, acting mainly in a supporting role to Phillips. Consequently, carrying on without Phillips must have seemed an impossible task. However, Nursery Crime was the result of numerous songwriting sessions and still included some of Phillips' compositional work. The musical box and Harlequin were written mainly by Mike and Ant and were then developed and elaborated on by the whole band, transforming the first into an extraordinary track. Tony and Peter, on the other hand, were the main authors of Seven Stones, Harold the Barrel, and The Fountain of Salmachus, the intro to which, however, dates back to a year earlier when Ant was still a part of Genesis, while the very first versions of The Return of the Giant Hogweed came about while the band were working as a four-piece. Finally, the two newcomers, Phil and Steve, wrote For Absent Friends together. Allowing this song to be included in the track list may, at first glance, seem like an act of generosity granted by the three old boys, but the fact of the matter is that during this period of confusion, Genesis needed new talent also on the writing front. With knowledge of the different writing sessions, one could consider Nursery Crime a transitional album, but, if truth be told, it was more a case of Genesis triumphing, not for the last time, in the face of adversity. The apparent fragmentation and undeniable personality clashes between the three founding members of the group would always fall into second place when it came to working hard, revealing an unexpected level of cohesion within the group, which would transform songs that had previously only been rough outlines into masterpieces, the musical box. Collins on drums lifts the entire rhythm section, together with Rutherford, who had evolved further still following the already remarkable improvements witnessed on Trespass. Despite still maintaining a strongly acoustic sound, without doubt inherited from Anthony Phillips, the new Genesis appeared more interested in the rhythmic aspects, and whilst on Trespass this manifested itself gradually, for example, on Stagnation, it was not a primary focus until the album's closing song, The Knife. On Nursery Crime, however, the contrast between acoustic and electric instrumentation is marked, strident even. The two songs, which are without a doubt the mainstays of the album, The Musical Box and The Fountain of Salmacis, live and breathe their own rhythm changes, alternating between calmer, more romantic moments and crazy, electrifying excursions. Hackett and Banks both play decisive roles in achieving this. The new guitarist certainly displays greater fluidity as a soloist than Phillips. In fact, his solos, despite not being outstanding from a technical point of view, are formidable in terms of experimental inventiveness. We should perhaps once again mention his first, pioneering attempts at tapping, a revolutionary technique which years later would be perfected and made famous by Eddie Van Halen, and their highly original sound. Banks, on the other hand, after being forced to play a solo on Stagnation and having practiced during their time as a four-piece, had acquired a new level of confidence and was about to become the leading soloist in the entire history of Genesis. Supported by a rich assortment of keyboards, by now the band had its very own mellotron. The result is the transformation of a primarily acoustic and pastoral band into an ensemble with increasingly broad horizons, a real rock band when it wanted to be, as in On the Return of the Giant Hogweed, while continuing to prioritize their attention towards acoustic music, which still dominates in Harlequin and For Absent Friends. Throughout all of these changes, Peter Gabriel's personality was continuing to grow. His voice manages to be unusually aggressive in the final section of The Musical Box and On the Return of the Giant Hogweed, mellow and expressive, 7 Stones, The Fountain of Salmacis. And even similar to pantomime in Harold the Barrel, this also thanks to the second voice provided by Phil, who was also given the honor of singing a song on his own, For Absent Friends. While Tony's and Mike's voices continue to be used here and there, especially on Harlequin, it is evident that with Phil Collins now in the band, Genesis had acquired a second top-class vocalist. In this regard, Gabriel proved he was prepared to share some of the limelight with the drummer, thus allowing the band to evolve in another direction. Peter was also continuing to perfect his ability to write beautiful lyrics, where poetry blends with cultural references. The words to The Musical Box are a miracle of lyricism and literature, somewhere between Oscar Wilde and childhood memories, while in The Return of the Giant Hogweed the young songwriter imagined a gigantic toxic plant rebelling against the human race. Standing as a case apart, we have Harold the Barrel, a grotesque yet thrilling story with a slightly Dickensian feel. Gabriel wrote around half of the lyrics on the album, with the other band members writing the rest. These other lyrics, although less sophisticated, are still of a very high level. Tony once more takes his inspiration from mythology for The Fountain of Salmacis, in collaboration with Peter and 7 Stones, putting pastel-colored poetic phrases together for Harlequin, while Steve, with a little help from his friend Phil, paints a beautiful and typically English image in the track For Absent Friends. Nursery Crime, therefore, presents itself as a unique album in the abundantly fertile music scene of the early 70s. After Trespass went on sale, the end of 1970 saw the release of The Man Who Sold the World by David Bowie, All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs by Eric Clapton's Derek and the Dominoes, and the first self-titled album by Gentle Giant. In addition, although still very much part of a niche market, we should mention the seminal recordings released by those two melancholy songwriters, Nick Drake, Bryda Laytour, and Tim Buckley, Starsailor. The first months of 1971 saw the release in America of the groundbreaking albums, If I Could Only Remember My Name by David Crosby, Tapestry by Carole King, and What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, all of which had very little impact on the young Genesis. On the other side of the Atlantic, alongside the evergreen Rolling Stones with Sticky Fingers, the world was witnessing the growth of other names linked to the new genre of progressive rock. Steve Howe joined Yes, who then released the Yes album, and Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Caravan released their own respective masterpieces, Aqualung, Tarkus, and In the Land of Grey and Pink, with Gentle Giant releasing The Magnificent, Acquiring the Taste. However, the idea of trying to pigeonhole Genesis into some kind of movement or musical category remains a purely academic exercise. The acoustic sections alternate with explosive rock, and the refined and yet humorous lyrics are unique in style at this point in rock history, and the technical level shown by the new members, with Hackett more ideologically inclined to follow the experimentations of Robert Fripp rather than the virtuosity of the classic guitar hero icon, further lifts the group, which was already promising to achieve some of the best progressive rock ever. The songs on the album Nursery Crime. Side 1. Song first. The Musical Box. Collins. Because we were starting from scratch, obviously, some of the good bits that hadn't been used before were brought back into the fold, as is normally the case. They had this bit called F-sharp left over from when Ant was still in the band. Banks. It developed when we were playing as a 4-piece, but it originally went back to the early days with Ant and Mike playing on 12-string guitars. I played guitar on it as well in the beginning part. A good 2/3 of this track was written in September 1969 by Rutherford and Phillips, and the original title of the song was due to the unusual way the 12-string guitars were tuned. Rutherford. I had this Rickenbacker guitar, and I started doing weird tunings. The tuning in this song is very bizarre with all the top 3 pairs of strings tuned to F-sharp, which is just mad. But it made that jangly sound, and it meant that the big chord which comes after had this lovely open-stringed feeling. Mike's Rickenbacker 12-string originally belonged to Charterhouse School friend John Alexander, the same friend who had given the demo tape to Jonathan King back in 1967. Alexander. Whilst still at school, my 12-string Rickenbacker went to Mike, and it indeed became a Genesis icon over the years. I believe it was one of the originals as owned by the Beach Boys, Townsend and Harrison, but unfortunately, it was stolen many years later at Madison Square Garden. So when I got its replacement back, probably 30 years later, it was a later version. Hackett. Mike used to use an electric 12-string with the top 6 strings tuned to F-sharp, because that was a keyboard player's key, and I played an electric 6-string. Mike and I played electric guitar, and Tony played an acoustic 12-string, which he used to put through a Leslie cabinet. We had 2 of them for the organ, and he sometimes used one for his guitar. The original demo of F-sharp, recorded by Mike and Ant, was eventually released in 1998 on Anthony Phillips' album The Archive Collection Volume 1. The song starts with a solitary guitar phrase played by Rutherford. Hackett. Mike's guitar was recorded at half speed, so when it's played back, it sounds higher than it did originally. It was a technique Genesis sometimes used called Verispeed. The Beatles used it a lot. Hackett's contribution is only very minor, as the song was all but complete when he joined. Hackett. The structure of the song was done, but I joined the band on the basis that, if I added anything to the details of the song, then I would be considered one of the writers. So I tried to create a musical moment that sounded like a musical box. When I listen to this now, however, there are so many things I would do differently to the mix. For example, why did we have the hi-hat at the beginning? It doesn't really need to be there. At 3 minutes and 39 seconds, a heavy riff from Mike kicks off the first instrumental bridge. Gabriel. Mike and I were big fans of The Who, and I really wanted to try and persuade Mike to play something like Pete Townsend, an arm-waving, ballsy attacking section. We were in the rehearsal rooms in West Hampstead on the 28 bus route, and it was exciting when it first came to gel as a piece. Hackett. It's just Mike, first of all, then I join him, and then the organ answers. Tony put his Hohner pianette through a fuzzbox because he was trying to sound like a guitarist, and in the last phrase, 4 minutes 20 seconds, you can hear me using the tapping technique. It's the earliest recorded example of that technique because I was trying to sound like a keyboard player. So Genesis had a keyboard player trying to sound like a guitarist and vice versa. I had tried it tapping at home for this song, and I tried it out live, and it worked okay. I just used a fuzz box, probably a Marshall Super Fuzz. As the first guitar solo takes off, the drums explode onto the scene. Collins. There was a song by Family called The Weaver's Answer with a kind of rolling rhythm. I had a pretty good foot, and they liked that. So I put that with their rhythm, and suddenly we were Rutherford. We'd had endless drummers up until then, but none of them were the same caliber as Phil. He brought a real lift and energy to the band. For example, if you take the second half of the musical box, we couldn't have done that with the other drummers. The metamorphosis in the sound is stunning, and the musical box, from an acoustic and bucolic opening section, transforms into something rhythmically overwhelming. Rutherford. This is my favorite track on Nursery Crime. It's a prime example of how we were going more electric. Starts soft and then it builds and by the end everything's going. And I think this must be the first time with the bass pedals, which we didn't need on Trespass when there were 5 of us. It's funny how things happen. You get stretched and you're forced into doing something. I'm sure if we hadn't been a 4-piece, I'd never have bothered to pick up the bloody bass pedals. Once the first electric phase ends, the song curls in on itself with a 12-string guitar arpeggio played by Mike and later joined by the organ, 8th minute, 34-second. Collins. Tony had this wonderful chord sequence at the end of the song. I don't think he had envisaged vocals on it, and Peter came in with, "You stand there with your fixed expression," sort of trampling all over this nice chord sequence. But, of course, it worked fantastically well. Banks. I think the real strength of the song comes towards the end, when the organ comes in playing this little sort of fugue-type thing, which I originally saw as an instrumental part. And then suddenly Pete started singing over it. I must admit, initially I wasn't too sure about it, and, in fact, when we did the mix of the album, we mixed the voice too low. But when we started playing this on stage, I realized just how strong it was. The vocal just gave it a real capping quality, and it was a real stand-up moment on stage. The version on the album is okay. It sounds a lot better now it's been remixed, but it probably developed even more live. It was a very good track that created a sort of well. It was a very atmospheric piece, and it was musically interesting as it went through all these changes. It was a sort of precursor of what was to come later with a lack of repetition, starting off with a really strong section, the opening part that never comes back again. We used to quite like the idea of having a very quiet bit going into a very loud bit and then a sort of serene bit. It's a song about a lot of contrasts, which for some people is very appealing, while other people just find it irritating, because it never settles into a groove but keeps changing time and chords. So it's a very typical Genesis song, a follow-on from Stagnation, I suppose, but perhaps a little bit more dramatic. The grand finale of this mini rock opera reaches an exceptional and emphatic climax. Hackett. When we did it live, all the audiences liked it very much. I think they liked the wide dynamics of one moment quiet, the next minute very loud. So in a way, it's typical of the band at that time. Right at the end of the song, I track my guitars in a 3-part harmony, but for some reason you can only hear 2. Brian May said to me that this track was an influence on him, and listening to the way it sounds at the end, you can see why that might have been the case. So, even if Hackett's songwriting role was purely marginal, it can be said that his stylistic influence was felt from the word go. Hackett. In terms of playing, yes, some things became influential for other people, and you have to remember that this album was not a huge success in its time. It found its audience over a long period of time. This extraordinarily evocative music is accompanied by some equally amazing lyrics. Peter took his inspiration from his grandfather's house located in Coxhill, with its garden, croquet lawn, conservatory, vines, and fig trees. The friendship between 2 children becomes a morbid allegory steeped in sexuality. Gabriel. I think my head at the time was in this Victorian world, which I pictured around the house my dad had grown up in, this sort of controlled English mental landscape under which festered violence and sex. This was the sort of flavor I was trying to bring into the lyrics and vocals. This was one of the regular battlegrounds with Tony. Blissfully unaware of the audience, he would want to stretch things out for 10 or 20 minutes for a big keyboard and instrumental part, whereas I was trying to tell a story too. There were a lot of arguments about those types of issues, probably more so in the latter days, like over Apocalypse and Supper's Ready and Some of the Lamb, because I just felt some of the keyboard solos were too long and we risked losing people. And it was important because you didn't want all the up moments to be instrumental only and all the down moments to be the vocal bits. I certainly didn't.
Side 1. Song 2nd, For Absent Friends. Oddly enough, Tony, Mike, and Pete gave newcomers Steve and Phil their own spotlight on the new album. Collins, Steve and I wrote the song because we were the 2 new boys and we wanted to see what we could do. The fact that it was on the album, I guess, is because it was very different from anything else, and I think we were quite happy to have that variety of tastes and musical output. Some people see this as very positive, while others see it as a lack of direction because there wasn't any one in particular. The song is based mainly on a simple chord sequence led by Mike and Steve on 12-string guitars. Hackett, Mike and I played 12-string on it, and Tony played a little bit of Hohner pianette. And that was the whole orchestration of the track. The tuning on this one is regular, but the guitar is being used almost like a harpsichord. The thing about Genesis is this combination of 12-string guitars. When they all work together, the distinction between guitars and keyboards is no longer there. Whenever a song was guitar-based, it usually meant 12-string and using chords that might not necessarily be obvious, but you can tell the classical and folk roots were there. This song was shaped in the rehearsal room. Hackett, I think most of it was written during the sessions at Tony Stratton Smith's country house. Phil and I would go off into a corner in the garden. One of the most surprising aspects is that the lead vocals were given to Collins. Hackett, it was the first thing I ever wrote for Genesis in my own right, and I was too shy to present it to the lead singer because Pete was very much the star. The thing is, a lot of people didn't realize it was Phil singing. I remember seeing them live, before I joined the band, and I thought there was some sort of automatic double tracking effect going on with Pete's voice, and then I looked a little closer, and I could see that Pete and Phil were in perfect sync with similar vocal tones. This made it much easier later on when Pete left. The fact that Phil sang lead vocals on the track wasn't a problem for the band. Rutherford, I think Pete enjoyed having Phil sing it. As a band, if anyone could do something and bring something new to the table, we would always encourage it. Hackett, the band's reaction to it was very good, and Pete was fine with it as well. I don't think anyone perceived it as a threat. Phil was probably thinking, I'll sing it, and if Pete likes it, he'll sing it. They also used to sing things together, they had similar voices, so sometimes it would sound like one singer. It was very fortunate for Genesis to have two singers with such strong voices. Banks, it's not my favorite moment on the album, but Phil's voice sounds very nice, very pure. It had a sort of James Taylor quality about it, before he got the rasp that was to come later. It showed that he had a nice voice, so we thought it would be great to feature it as a solo thing, and Pete was quite happy with that. The lyrics, so beautifully English, are set in a churchyard and feature a pair of widows. Hackett, the song is mine musically, lyrically it's 50-50. I think it was one of the first things Phil wrote as well. I was never sure that people would be able to understand the story just by listening to the lyrics because it's not obvious. The references on this album are quite wide. The first track, The Musical Box, is best described as Victoriana, the world of mechanicals and musical boxes, and I think it explodes into life very well. It is a clever song, but this one is a lot simpler. It's a simple, direct little Cinderella song. It's very shy, but it has charm, like a miniature in a gallery of portraits. I was trying to think of something that wasn't a love song. I was thinking of two old women at the end of their lives, and I was trying to describe a typically English scene. I think the love of places, trying to describe them in a song, and your relationship to the place is just as important as describing the individuals you might be with. Sometimes those landscapes are a little bit like paintings. I think I confuse writing songs with doing paintings or writing books. Side 1. Song 3rd, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. It would appear that the seeds for this song were sown when the band was working as a four-piece, just after Collins had joined. Hackett, at the time, whenever we played live, we used to play the knife as the last number of the set, and we wanted to have something to replace that, so we could have a big finish. So this was really designed with that in mind. The Return of the Giant Hogweed is a gutsy song with a strong rock impact and features phenomenal drumming from Collins. Hackett, it was written as a kind of joke, a long elaborate joke, but the rhythm is interesting. Tony always used to call it 5 against 2, like a shuffle. 5 against 2 is a polyrhythm, i.e. the simultaneous use of two or more conflicting rhythms, that are not readily perceived as deriving from one another. In fact, the song took on its definitive form when Steve arrived and played the introduction using his tapping technique in sync with Tony on the electric piano. Hackett, I was tapping on the guitar, on the bass string, while Tony was playing his pianette in harmony to it. The introduction is my major contribution to the song. In the 4th minute and 15 seconds, a truly original instrumental section takes off with electric guitar and flute playing together. Hackett, it's not really a classic guitar solo,
It's more of an arranged thing with my melody on the top doubled with the flute. And the piano arpeggio later is not really a rock keyboard thing, is it? In the 5th minute and 21st second, another, very subtle guitar solo melody comes in. Hackett, I was trying to sound like a synth here, pizzicato. I was still using a plectrum at that time, but the tapping was with the nails rather than the pads of the fingers. In the 6th minute and 31st second, you hear the mellotron brass come in. It's mixed brass because you had different types. He, Banks, sometimes used to put the mellotron through the Leslie cabinet, so ironically it came out sounding more like an organ at times, but we tried to do sounds that were very complementary to each other. In the lyrics, Gabriel tells the story of the plant world turning against humanity in the form of the giant hogweed, Heracleum mantegazionum. Hackett, again, the meaning of the lyrics has a Victorian feel. Kew Gardens comes into it.
Side 2. Song first, 7 Stones. The opening is a magnificent chord sequence played on the organ using a little trickery. Hackett, this song uses organ and English accordion, but quite distorted on the mellotron. After 2 verses, in the 1st minute, 17 seconds, the singing by Gabriel and Collins almost acts as a lament. Hackett, this bit was mine. These days, I would probably make that into a whole chorus. You can hear the distortion on the tapes of the mellotron, the crescendo, in the 1st minute, 34 seconds. I think it's Mike's Vox bass pedals. The effect is quite in-like, almost similar to what Procol Harum were doing, the stuff they did with Matthew Fisher, with an admiration of and respect for church music. I think Tony's classical influence is Shostakovich, whereas in my case it was Bach and Vaughan Williams. After repeating the entire structure reached to this point and a short and emotional distorted guitar phase from Steve, we get to the magnificent orchestral section. Hackett, at the end you get mellotron strings, 3 minutes, 56 seconds. Trying to play very high, like a harp, while the guitar sounds like brass. In spirit, it's quite close to Sibelius, and at the end, from the 4th minute, 36th second. To the last notes on the mellotron, it gets quite strange. A song written mainly by Tony Hackett, going off the chord changes, I'd say so, who was also the author of the lyrics in which an old man tells his tales. Even though, according to Hackett, Pete was interested in the ideas he had read in the I Ching, so the lyrics were influenced by the Book of Changes. Side 2. Song second, Harold the Barrel. This is followed by a sort of progressive mini operetta. In fact, the next track presents itself in a very different way, with a thumping piano and an excited feel. Hackett, I always felt that there was something of Summer in the City, by Love and Spoonful, about the chord sequence. It's a clever idea, but, if I'm honest, I think it's a bit of a filler on the album. It's like one of those deadpan English humor jokes put to music. Perhaps it could have been funnier. Some of the subsequent things we did became very funny. Collins, it was a good fun song which showed the kind of humor that there has always been in Genesis. People might take us very seriously but we don't. Gabriel, it was part of a little subsection of Genesis, these odd, quite English bits of songwriting which continued with Willow Farm, and I can see the connection in Father, Son, from Ovo, 2000, and in what I've been doing in recent years. You could call it English Gabriel writing. Thanks to the switches between the different characters in the song, Man in the Street, Man on the Council, British Public, Mrs. Barrel, this song steeped in British humor has, in the words of Hackett, an aspect of Gilbert and Sullivan about it, and almost all of it is sung with 2 voices, those of Peter and Phil. Thanks, they sing it together. In fact, they're actually mixed on the tape, so you can't separate them, which maybe wasn't a great idea, because sometimes it sounds a little Phil-biased. But it's a clever song that works really well. Gabriel, my voice has got quite a lot of bass content, whereas Phil's has a much higher element, so he's sort of the center of gravity, harmonically speaking. So if you put the two at exactly the same level, you'll hear more of his voice than mine. Even though Harold the Barrel was all my song, you hear just as much of Phil, if not more, in some places. When I left, and that voice continued as the lead singer, it was easier for people to get used to. Phil is a very natural singer, so I think it should have occurred to the others to try Phil earlier than they did. Collins, on this song, vocally speaking, Peter and I bonded quite well. Neither Mike nor Tony, nor Steve, for that matter, were singers. So, if there was any other singing to be done, it was always going to be me. They did have a couple of little bits of harmonies, but they always asked me to do it because they said I was quicker and better at it than they were. So I remember sitting around a piano with Peter while he came up with Harold the Barrel and we both wrote the lyrics for it. At one point, there is a repeated line, "We can help you. We can help you" at the first minute and 36 seconds and at the second minute and 26th second, where the timbres of the two vocalists are unrecognizable. Hackett, the idea was to do a parody of a British policeman. It was Phil or Pete. Even then, Pete didn't like anyone to be around when he was doing his vocals. I quite understand it, you don't want to be performing to the gallery when you are trying new things. At the end of the track, there was a voice loop that kept going, although it seems to have faded out here, so perhaps it's not the same as the original. It might have been slowed down.
Side 2. Song 3rd, Harlequin. Rutherford. Harlequin was an acoustic song that I think I did. I'm not convinced it's very good, but at the time, it was an area in which I worked quite well. We were playing more and more gigs and starting to drop some of the softer side because half an hour of acoustic stuff on stage, well, it didn't work that great. People were at the bar and not listening. So we found a compromise between where we'd come from and where we were going. Written by Mike with the help of Anthony Phillips, this piece has a relatively simple acoustic structure. Hackett. This is mainly two 12 strings with a little bit of mellotron, a little bit of organ, and just a tiny bit of electric guitar playing one phrase. While at IN34 you have mellotron vibraphone, which sounds nothing like a vibraphone. But then the mellotron flutes on Strawberry Fields Forever, the Beatles, sounded nothing like flutes. Banks! Starting from Nursery Crime, we had 16 tracks, so particularly with this album in Foxtrot, we were just suddenly able to find space that wasn't there before. I was there all the time, with every track on this album, helping or hindering, as the case may be, Nick Davis while he was doing the 5.1 mixes, trying to give the group's point of view, because sometimes some songs end up further away than they should, and others end up sounding great straight away. So revisiting these songs was great for me because I hadn't heard a lot of them for a long time, and I had preconceived ideas about them. For example, I used to think Harlequin was a very weak song, but on hearing it again, I realized it was pretty good. It was a strange process, though, spending 2 years being able to reassess what you feel, exploring and reliving the past. Hackett. Right at the end, I play a thing called a sleigh tambourine very high. I was trying to make it sound very sweet, so it sounds quite Christmassy in a way. Sometimes, when I was playing 12-string with Genesis, I would play it almost outside the range of the guitar to make it sound very sweet. So in a way, I thought it was a very feminine, chocolate box type of a song. The vocals are the main feature of the track. Hackett. I think the vocals could have been recorded more strongly, because when we rehearsed it everyone sounded much fuller. It sounded a lot more like Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Tony and Mike also sang on the track alongside Peter and Phil. Hackett. I was too shy to sing in those days. I thought I would sing out of tune. I became a singer much later on. Banks. We all sang it. There was a castrati chorus. We did it as a vocal harmony, which was something we used to do in the garden at Tony Stratton Smith's country house when we were writing Nursery Crime. It was beautiful weather, so we used to just go outside with our guitars and just strum along. We were trying to have our Crosby, Stills, and Nash moment, and it almost worked. We all had reasonable voices. Mike and I aren't character voices, but we can sing in tune, and up to that point, we always used to do it, starting with From Genesis to Revelation and Trespass. But once Phil came into the band, his voice was so much better. It was much better for him, and Pete to double track if more than 2 harmonies were needed.
Side 2. Song 4th. The Fountain of Salmacis. Banks. When we got together at Tony Stratton Smith's house and started putting all these ideas together, the writing was easier than it was on Trespass, but it still wasn't that easy. I suppose we drew from a few old songs that we had around. I had this piece that I'd written when I was at university. It was just a simple organ part, really, which I then started developing once we decided to buy a mellotron. We bought it because we loved the sound. We had used it a little bit on Trespass. We loved the first King Crimson album, where obviously it was used more extensively. So we went and bought one off King Crimson, actually. We tried this little riff I'd started on the mellotron, and with the organ it really developed these great big swells, and it sounded fantastic, and that's how the opening part of the Fountain of Salmacis came about. In fact, the intro of the song makes an appearance, with few variations, in Provocation, one of the tracks commissioned by the BBC for the planned 1970 documentary on the painter Michael Jackson. Hackett. One day, I heard Tony playing this introduction by himself, mixing organ and mellotron, and I told him it sounded really good. He said it was part of another song called Catch that had never been recorded. I suggested we use it, encouraging him and trying to bring out what was natural to Tony. At a stage when his songwriting input was still rather limited, the guitarist proved useful in other ways. Hackett. I felt that my role was complementary, and often it was quite difficult to work out what a lead guitarist was going to do, because they were already fairly self-sufficient even as a three-piece, as they later became. So I would be forced to think a little bit like an orchestral arranger as opposed to someone required to do heroic guitar solos. That's why we were all credited with writing all the songs, because we considered the arrangements to be as important as writing the actual material. All of the detail was equally important, but I think most bands don't function like that. Genesis may be a one-off in that department. The Fountain of Salmacis is an intricate song that alternates calm sections with more up-tempo passages, where Rutherford demonstrates significant progress as a bass player. Hackett. Mike played bass, and I played both electric and 12-string guitar on this, and occasionally electric guitars in harmony, right at the end, and 12-string in the chorus. Well, what we would call a chorus isn't, in fact, a chorus. Our songs are distinct from most other people's in that they don't have choruses. In those days, we didn't know how to write choruses. I didn't really understand what a chorus was, and the band often disagreed about what was a verse and what was a chorus. I think the nearest thing to a chorus is the bit at the 3rd minute, 6th second. But it has no repeated phrase. There is always a vocal variation, and then it goes into a shuffle. At the 3rd minute, 25th second, there is a keyboard and guitar duet, an aspect reminiscent of Sibelius, along with other things peculiar to Tony. While the opening section was composed solely by Banks, the keyboard player remembers that we all developed the rest with a lot of jamming, which produced a strongly romantic track. It is extraordinary to hear the complexity of the songs played by these 5 young lads who were only in their early 20s. Hackett. At the time, it was my favorite song on the album because it had got as close to fully symphonic as we could manage. I believe its true home is on the stage where you can be enveloped by those crescendos. It deserves to be played live again, and I know that some tribute bands do it. There is something unique about it, like the change at 6 minutes, 27 seconds, and the bass pedal under the mellotron gives it a very beautiful melody. In the rehearsal room, I remember there was a lot of reverb on Peter's voice, which gave it a more operatic feel. It's got an Italian spirit, and it's probably closer to opera than it is to rock. I love the end part, 7th minute, 31 second. I wanted more reverb on the guitar, but I couldn't voice that at the time. We had something in the rehearsal room that was special, but we weren't skilled enough producers to realize that we could have changed the perspectives. I agonize about all of that now, and I think it's such a shame that people didn't get to hear what it sounded like when it was originally written. I wish it could have sounded as good as it did in the rehearsal room. I remember when we worked on what became the end of the track, we'd all had dinner one night, but we went back into the rehearsal area, which we'd named Toad Hall from the story The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, for reasons best known to ourselves, and we were all very relaxed. I played a guitar solo over the top of it, and we had a few colored lights around, and it felt absolutely magical. It was a new kind of music. No one was using the term symphonic rock back then, but I think that's probably what that was. You had the strings, you had the choir, the guitar solo. For me, it was a very big emotional moment. I was really moved by it. I had refined the guitar part, I'd written it rather than just improvising, so you had this crying guitar over a beautiful sea of sound. As a piece of music, it was very crescendo-based, like classical music. In terms of the lyrics, according to Hackett, Tony and Peter wrote the words based on Greek mythology. Banks The lyrics are based on the myth of Salmachus and Hermaphroditus, something very different from anything on the previous album. It took us in another direction. It's an area that some people really like about us, while others really don't. It's a defining kind of song, overblown and quite romantic, and it goes through lots of musical changes. It was an exciting moment, I think. The album artwork, Gabriel, Paul Whitehead captured a mood, although in an external scene because of the croquet game, a sort of suppressed violence which I think was accurate for the vibe we were trying to portray at the time. Rutherford, the image of the little girl, the croquet lawn, and the heads helped to create a slightly quirky atmosphere about the band, together with the songs and Pete's performance. I felt we were starting to become something a little unique in the music business in England, and I think that was a good thing. The picture represents images from the musical box and other parts of the album. It's an area where Paul Whitehead worked very well. I think later on we kind of lost the plot a bit there, but initially it was good. Collins. Paul Whitehead came up with the idea for the album cover, having discussed a couple of ideas over the phone with Pete. It was in the days before email, so if you wanted to see something, you actually had to all get together in a room and look at it. The croquet with heads idea was all very off the wall. Fortunately, it wasn't as romantic and wistful as the Trespass cover, even though there was a knife on it, which was good because it showed that there was a little bit of an unusual side to the band. Thanks. We got on well with Paul, and so we stuck with him for the first 3 albums. I've always felt that the album covers got slightly less good as they went along. The first was a great idea and well executed, the second worked quite well for the album, and the third one, I think, was less good. After that, we parted company. If you're in a group, you can't really change the members, even though it happens. But you can change other things like producers or engineers or covers just to give a different feel to the different albums. Who you have as a cover artist is an arbitrary choice, and there was no reason to stick with the same one forever. Funnily, I almost prefer this cover now than I did at the time. It's so much a part of my past and youth. I signed so many copies of it that it's rather difficult to have an objective viewpoint, but I think it's a strong image and it fits well with the idea of the title of the album and the association with the musical box. Epilogue. Nursery Crime was released in November 1971. Despite public praise from Keith Emerson in Melody Maker, on the whole, the press didn't warm to the album, and it sold fewer copies than Trespass in the UK. However, following their success in Belgium, Italy too began to show significant interest in the band. Rutherford. I think it's a good example of how we were moving on. Some of it's good and some of it is just okay. Hackett. We were doing loads of gigs at the time, and we'd spend the odd day in a windy church hall trying to write songs together, but it wasn't working. So we pulled out of gigs for the entire summer of 1971. We just bought a new Mellotron, and I had a new Les Paul and amplifier. I still get people writing to me asking what fuzz box I was using back then. I think people like the fact that it was very mechanical, that things were held together by sticky tape and chewing gum. It made it all a lot more individual. Happy accidents abound all over it. None of it was that focused. I remember this crazy thing about mixing the musical box. We kept working all night long because everyone refused to do edits, one mistake and you went back to the beginning of the song. It beggars belief now, but that's how we worked back then. Thanks. For me, there was definitely an improvement in the writing compared to Trespass, so we were certainly pleased with the artistic progress. But even though we were making progress in the live sense, commercially we weren't going anywhere. Nursery Crime did no better than Trespass. So it was slightly disappointing for us because we thought that songs like The Musical Box, The Fountain of Salmachus, and The Return of the Giant Hogweed in particular were really strong pieces and on stage were going down really well. But for some reason, we only sold about 5,000 or 6,000 copies. Hackett. It was a very creative period, and I was very happy to be working on the first really professional record with a dedicated team. It seemed to be a great opportunity for all of us. I think my perception of it may have been slightly different from that of the other, more experienced guys. For me, it was divine, heavenly to be in that position of making a real record, and I wanted to make it very strong. I didn't always know how to fulfill those ambitions, because I was quite inexperienced. I felt I wasn't an experienced songwriter, but I could recognize good things in others and could try to bring that out. I wanted to encourage other people to be at their best. Collins, generally speaking, it was a very strong album, I think. At the time, I was much more of a player. I wasn't really writing apart from the few lines in Harold the Barrel with Pete and For Absent Friends. We were jamming a lot together to write songs, but I wasn't actually a bona fide writer. The two voices style happened like this. I did the harmonies, so when we were writing something, I would always sing. Rather than singing the melody, I'd sort of sing something else, which then became part of the song. Hackett. When I listen to it now, I am more critical than I was then, and I think you'll find all the band members are probably like that. If I were doing it now, I'd make sure it was all in time and in tune with all the right compressors and with all the technology of now, but we didn't have any of that. But we had such a huge well of talent all working towards the same goal. I also think Richard MacPhail was very important to the band at the time. He was part roadie, part manager, part enthusiast, coach, critic, overseer, friend. I loved his input. He had a very quiet way about him, but at live gigs he was a roadie and mixing sound, and he knew how to get a job done. He could be quite tough despite his public school background. He was quite fierce and loyal. If I said, "I don't know if I'm good enough for this," he would say, "Of course you are, and you must continue in the same way." When, years later, Chester Thompson joined for live work, I tried to do the same thing with him, as the first concert did not go well. I said, "Don't worry, you'll be great. It will be fine. It's just one gig." Let's just say that to hold things together is very important. Of course, you have to be critical because music can't afford to be sacred until it's finally on record. So I could sometimes be critical, but also I like to think I could be very liberal with praise. It was a bit like trying to be the glue I wanted this band to work. The album has a lot of good things on it, and I think the people who like it hear it with the same ears as when they were teenagers, so they forgive it lots of things, just like me when I listened to the early Beatles and early Stones.
Concerts. Hackett. It was strange working with Genesis. It was different. We ended up playing gigs at places like Stowe and Eton, and these all-male audiences were tremendously enthusiastic. After just a month's break from touring, Genesis were back on the road with a handful of live shows in September, before undertaking a more packed schedule in October, which included a dozen or so dates in the UK. The one at the Lyceum on October 14th with Van der Graaf Generator marked the start of a joint tour known as the One Price Concerts. During this period of their history, Genesis often shared the stage, usually as openers, with other charisma bands, particularly Van der Graaf Generator, but later also with Audience and Lindisfarne. The tour continued through to November. In the meantime, the first record with the new lineup had finally hit the high streets, and on more than one occasion, Genesis turned out to be the headliner. For example, on 20th in Letchworth, Circe opened for them. For December, the Gibus Club in Paris had organized a series of concerts featuring foreign bands, such as Amon Duel 2 from Germany and Mungo Jerry from England. Genesis was also contacted, and their name was added to the billboard for Friday, December 17th. However, the idea of a sortie to continental Europe in the midleaf a series of UK dates proved to be unworkable, and so the band's debut performance in France had to be postponed. 1972 immediately promised to be an important year. Following a couple of days rehearsing in West Hampstead, and after a gig at the Friars in Aylesbury scheduled for January 8 was cancelled on the 9th, Genesis had a session in the BBC Studio T1 in Shepherd's Bush, which would later be aired as part of the well-known radio program, Sounds of the 70s with John Peel. This was the second time the band had entered the famous London studios with its new lineup. Only this time the program envisaged a longer performance with the band playing 4 songs from Nursery Crime: Harold the Barrel, Harlequin, The Fountain of Salmachus, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Between the 22nd and the 24th of January, Genesis returned to Belgium, where they also took part in a festival in Charleroi, with Super Sister and Will and Paolo supporting. A bootleg recording of this show, probably only partial, survives to this day, revealing the following set list: Happy the Man, Stagnation, The Fountain of Salmachus, Twilight Alehouse, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. After a pretty hectic February, during which the band continued to play up and down the UK, including venues such as the Queen Elizabeth Hall, London on the 4th, and the Oval Hall at Sheffield City Hall on the 17th, Genesis received their third invitation to the BBC for March 2nd, this time in the Paris studios. Here they played The Fountain of Salmacis, The Musical Box, and The Return of the Giant Hogweed. This performance was aired in its entirety as part of the in-concert program. 2 days later in Watford, the setlist included Harlequin, Stagnation, The Fountain of Salmacis, Twilight Alehouse, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife. By this time, the band's live shows were pretty much defined, with the tried and tested formula of a soft acoustic start with 3 12-string acoustic guitars, including Tony Banks, starting with Happy the Man or Harlequin, both sung by Peter and Phil with the drummer, in the latter case standing alongside the lead singer in the center of the stage while also playing maracas.
The first part of the concert was rather sedate from a visual point of view, with all the band seated except for Peter. It wasn't until about halfway through Stagnation that Tony put down his guitar and began playing the organ, while all the other electrical instruments only made their appearance during the third song. Hackett on his Gibson and Rutherford on bass, and later on his Electra 12-string Rickenbacker, while at the same time using bass pedals. Collins, I think people tend to like things when it's all the same. I mean, if you go and see a Metallica concert, you know what you're going to get, and you don't really want to see 3 acoustic guitars halfway through. Variety was something we played on back then, which is why the band used to open shows with acoustic guitars, like Happy the Man. But it didn't go down very well. Then gradually, throughout the first 2, 3, or 4 songs, we got more electric, and then, of course, we ended up with a Knife, which was the other end of the scale. That appealed to us, you know, and it appealed to a lot of our fans. I mean, there weren't many of them, but those that did follow us around were very supportive. With Hackett and Collins in the band, the Electra percentage shot up. Stagnation, despite incorporating some up-tempo sections, still preserves a mainly acoustic matrix. The Fountain of Salmacis is a symphonic piece, beautifully constructed by Tony Banks keyboards, whereas an atypical but fundamental song in this phase is Twilight Alehouse, with its unusual structure, its psychedelic sounds, and its blues and jazz overtones. Surprisingly, for Genesis, the only real solo in the song is by Peter on flute, while Hackett tirelessly embellishes the rhythm of Rutherford's 12-string. The final triptych, starting from the second half of the musical box when Mike remains on his own with his arpeggio, is absolutely magnificent. Hackett, when we played this live, Tony would put the guitar down and get ready to play the keyboards for the big organ moment. Another core song was The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Hackett, it's very symphonic, and Live It was deafeningly loud. In a rehearsal room, I used to put my foot full down on the pedal. You didn't want to be standing in the way of the amp. In those days, I was either inaudible, in other words, too quiet, or I was far too loud. There was nothing in between. Pete sometimes used to run around on stage and crash in my amplifier and send it flying. I remember it happening during this song in Hemel Hempstead. He crashed into my amp, and suddenly, no sound. With the Knife, the transformation can be considered complete, throwing one mighty punch at the enthralled audience by the sheer, almost violent, transformation of what initially started as a group of sweet and sensitive musicians, yet also characterized by a touch of typical English eccentricity, enlarged by the surreal stage presence of Gabriel, a profoundly timid person in real life. The singer was unwillingly forced to come up with something to keep the audience entertained during the all too frequent technical problems and pauses needed to retune the guitars. Hackett. I was less keen to use different tunings because I knew what a nightmare it would be using all these different 12 strings with different tunings live. It could take 2 hours before the gig to tune them up, and sometimes we would have to start all over again. Sometimes Mike would say, after we had been tuning for what seemed like hours, I'm going to change the strings. We didn't have anyone to tune them up for us, and we didn't have tuners. We had a note from the organ and had to hope that the organ stayed and that the 12 string stayed, and sometimes they didn't. The Mellotron was a joy as well. When we did the Fountain of Salmacis, we were lucky if it ended up in the same key as the rest of the band. We needed a voltage stabilizer, which we got eventually, but we didn't know that at the time.
A promise of greatness that brought great frustration when it sounded all off-key. It was a cross between the fulfillment of a great dream and a nightmare. March, despite the odd concert here and there, including one on the 11th at Friars, was dedicated mainly to intensifying rehearsals, 7 to 9 in West Hampstead, 13 to 15 at Woolwich, and 29 to 31 in Blackheath. Mid-month, The band was included in the lineup of the Fête Saint Gratien in France, a two-day festival, 18th and 19th, hosting an array of bands: Van der Graaf Generator, Wishbone Ash, 10 Years After, Nico, and Gong. To play their slot on Saturday 18th, Genesis were forced to cancel their gig at the Boat Club in Nottingham. Immediately afterwards, the band was invited to a Belgian TV studio to record 4 songs live: The Fountain of Salmacis, Twilight Alehouse, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, which were aired on April 22nd as part of the program Pop Shop 72, also broadcast in some locations as Rock of the 70s. It is an eye-opening clip with the musicians lined up in the studio, concentrating on their instruments. From the left, Mike Rutherford with 12-string guitars, acoustic and electric, bass and bass pedals, Steve Hackett, seated with his black Gibson Les Paul on his lap, Phil Collins on drums, Tony Banks on keyboards and 12-string. At the front is Peter Gabriel, thin with long straight hair, dressed in black with a heavy gold-colored pendant around his neck. The vocalist is still in his pre-makeup days, but captures the spectators' attention with his charisma, even though he sometimes appears to be sheltering behind his bass drum, tambourine, and flute. At this point, Genesis were ready for a new challenge, an Italian tour with half a dozen dates running from 6 to April 19th. The man behind the tour was Maurizio Salvadori, a young Milanese promoter who was learning the ropes with Franco Mammone. Maurizio deserves all our praise for going beyond the call of duty, also with the press, to make sure Genesis and Van der Graaf Generator found an Italian distributor and managed to play live in Italy. Alas, his commendable enthusiasm was not matched by impeccable organizational skills. The first concert, on April 6th, should have been in Belluno, but for reasons unknown, it ended up being rescheduled at the last minute and moved to Adria, about 100 miles away. After a concert in Godega di Sant'Urbano, province of Treviso, serious issues arose with the third date, scheduled for Trieste on April 8th, while the band was driving the 87 miles between one gig and the next. The police closed the venue where they were supposed to be playing, Dancing Paradiso, for security reasons. This episode would be mentioned the following day, Saturday 9th, by Gabriel during their performance in San Martino Buon Albergo, near Verona, a partial recording of which exists featuring Happy the Man, The Fountain of Salmacis, drum solo, Twilight Alehouse, Rock Me Baby, and The Musical Box. The drum solo, which Gabriel emphatically presents as being performed with only one hand, is obviously a way of covering up the usual technical issues. Rock Me Baby, on the other hand, was the title given on this occasion to an as-yet unreleased track which made its live debut on Italian soil, a primitive version of what would later become known as Can Utility and the Coastliners. Hackett, it was a difficult song to get across, and some of the parts weren't that refined at the time we were doing them. We found that it didn't really work live. Perhaps, if we'd persisted with it, it would have worked out, but if an audience won't be quiet, it's impossible to get across a song that's based on an acoustic guitar. Something like that would never have worked in the USA. Americans just want a boogie, they want a rock, and Genesis did anything but.
The band played 2 concerts in Verona, one in the afternoon and one in the evening, a pleasant occurrence which was due to the high demand for tickets and something which would be repeated in other locations across the country. Thanks. There was a very variable response from audiences. Sometimes we didn't get that many people, but there were some shows where you seemed to get a lot of people who were quite enthusiastic. The point was you were trying to put together a tour, so you had filler shows between one major concert and the next. 2 Palasport shows followed, one in Pesaro, with none other than Italian progressive rock band Premiata Forneria Marconi opening, and one in Reggio Emilia. During soundchecks, Tony used to play a chord sequence to check out the sound of the mellotron, the instrument that was giving the band the most hassle due to its poor tuning stability. The power and impact these chords had in the Italian palasports, indoor sports arenas, led to the band developing them further, which is how they became the intro to a new song. Unfortunately, the concert on April 13th in a dance hall in Corn, province of Turin, was adversely affected by Tony Banks falling ill. Banks, who spent much of the next 24 hours getting closely acquainted with some of the primitive Italian toilets of the time, says, We'd gone to see this place where they made drums, and on the way there I'd had some Parma ham or something. Anyhow, I got there and I just felt like death. I mean, I had the whole thing of squatting over holes in the ground, all that. They took me to a hospital where they gave me what I assume was an anti-nausea injection, and it made me feel like my hands were on fire. It was awful. I went on stage anyway, but I couldn't really do anything at all. The other guys decided to try and do the songs that didn't feature too much keyboard, and the knife, which was about all I could do. We did what we could, but rather than doing an hour and a half, we ended up only doing about 40 minutes. And then the promoter wouldn't pay us because we hadn't done the full show, even though there weren't too many people in the audience, so I don't think they cared that much. It was a bad experience. It really took me about 2 or 3 weeks to get over it. It wasn't until we ended up in Marseilles, where this doctor gave me lots of injections and things, that I managed to get better. I found it very depressing because every time we went out for a meal in Italy, I'd go there with great intent, but as soon as I looked at the food, I felt sick again. Beppe Cravella, who would later become the keyboard player in the jazz rock band from Turin, Arti Mestieri, has recently restored the priceless tape which he himself recorded of the concert, giving us a precise set list of this one-off and rather brief show. Happy the Man, Stagnation, The Musical Box, and Twilight Alehouse, with the first and last songs played by only 4 members of the band, without Banks, and only the 2 central songs being played by the whole band. On the 14th, at Palazzo dell'Esposizione in Pavia, Genesis performed 2 concerts, one of which was recorded and included Happy the Man, The Fountain of Salmacis, Twilight Alehouse, Bye Bye Johnny, the new title given by Gabriel to the provisional version of Can Utility and the Coastliners, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife. The Pavia date is remembered most of all for the stone-throwing incident, which involved the audience complaining about the price of the ticket, 1,500 lire, and resulted in a police officer receiving a head injury. Banks. In Pavia, they sort of broke the glass doors down and stuff. When we planned to go back to do another tour, they said we couldn't because it was too dangerous. It always seemed to me that people wanted to come on stage, you'd get the odd person leaping up and grabbing the microphone, and you'd get people making political speeches, and they'd always be either to the far left or the far right. They seemed to me very polarized, but I think the Italians are more excitable people than the English, so you kind of accepted that. And there was this thing about free music, which is the other thing everyone wanted. On April 5th, Genesis arrived in Lugo in the Emilia-Romagna region, where they played in a club called Hit Parade. Thanks to a recording made at this event, a rare version of Going Out to Get You can be listened to. A staple of their shows back to when Anthony Phillips, the song's author, was still in the band. Going Out to Get You was a cornerstone of the set when Genesis were playing live as a 4-piece, before the arrival of Steve Hackett. The band would continue to play it occasionally as a 4-piece, with Banks dominating the performance with a clearly 60s-inspired organ part, reminiscent of Keith Emerson, and Rutherford's distorted bass following Phil's surging drums. It was a song which usually got brought out for particularly enthusiastic audiences as a second encore after The Knife, to which it is similar in some ways. In fact, it came close to taking its place on Trespass when the time came to record the album. Banks. I had forgotten we played that on the Italian tour as well. It had some good bits, if I remember rightly. After a concert in a club in Trevigliato near Brescia, Genesis played the Palasport in Siena. Banks. In England, we played wherever we could, and we got a variable reaction, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Nursery Crime aroused a bit of interest in Italy, so we had a bit more of an audience when we toured over there. We seemed to be able to play reasonably sized places in a way we couldn't begin to do in England, so it was quite exciting for us. The tours are all very muddled up in my mind, but I remember doing the show in Siena, which was in a very bizarre Palasport, very tall with all this echo due to the structure of the building. The Mellotron never sounded better thanks to all that fantastic resonance. The tour ended in style in the 2 biggest cities of central and southern Italy, Rome and Naples. In Rome, with Tony Stratton-Smith flying in especially from the UK, at Alberigo Crocetta's legendary Piper Club, where, despite the usual technical issues, Collins was forced to perform his customary drum solo, while the sound from Hackett's guitar literally disappeared in the middle of his solo in the musical box. The crowd were bewitched by a powerful performance which to their delight included 2 encores. The set list was Happy the Man, Stagnation, The Fountain of Salmacis, Twilight Alehouse, Drum Solo, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife, going out to get you. The Rome concert was also blessed with a visit from a television crew. The RAI, Italy's public broadcasting company, interviewed the band in the dressing rooms and filmed some extracts of the first 2 songs on the setlist. This brief TV coverage, which was never completed, some of the footage has no audio, and never aired, would eventually be released as part of the bonus material in the 2008 remastered issue of Foxtrot, revealing the earnest expressions on the faces of the audience as captured by the TV cameras. Banks. Genesis audiences tended to be quite quiet and attentive, like us. In the early days, we attracted a sort of intense person to our shows. I would say that Italy took us a bit before England did. You got people who would be listening very intensely, and by that stage we had a little bit more of an audience over there. But we were starting to get the same kind of response in England. It wasn't until we started doing the big venues later on that the audience got noisy. Before that, there wouldn't have been a lot of noise in the audience throughout the whole show. When we did these very quiet pieces with just acoustic guitar, there was total attention, which was great. It was a really nice experience. The grand finale was in Naples. In the afternoon, Mike and Tony wrote the lyrics to the new song dominated by Banks' Mellotron, Watcher of the Skies, inspired by the view from the roof of their hotel, the Domitiana, overlooking the Mostra di Ultramare, Naples trade exhibition site, where the Mediterraneo Theater is located. Here, the band played its tried and tested setlist, without any major incidents except for one covered by the usual drum solo before the concluding song, The Knife. An enormously successful tour, despite the incredible variety in venues, theaters, palace ports, small clubs, banks. In those days, it didn't make too much difference to us because we didn't really have the equipment to sort of make much difference. I think we were probably happiest in the mid-sized venues, really, but playing the palace sports in Italy was great fun. We were playing palace sports in Italy and then going back to playing really tiny clubs in England. It was a real contrast of places. When you're playing in the smaller places, you're much more conscious that the audience can hear you much more clearly, so it's more nerve-wracking because every note can be heard and people are hanging over you and can actually see you. Once you get to the bigger places, you're on a big stage and a bit removed from everything, and those big places are a bit echoey and the sound is less precise. With their first Italian tour under their belt, Genesis went on to do some more dates in other European countries, playing yet again in Belgium, Arlon, on April 22nd, and their first ever gig in Germany, Frankfurt, on the 23rd. May was dedicated to touring the UK with a dozen or so gigs culminating on the 29th at the Great Western Express Festival near Lincoln.
Despite the problems caused by the adverse weather conditions, the lineup of artists from diverse genres, Joe Cocker, Humble Pie, Sha Na Na, and the rather poor slot, in the afternoon, Genesis had the chance to play in front of a reportedly 50,000-strong crowd, with Gabriel wearing noticeable makeup, a large necklace and 2 bracelets over his black sweater. From a musical point of view, this performance included the debut of the previously unheard and still-to-be-released Watcher of the Skies. June began with a gig in Hastings, on the 2nd, where for the first time ever the band had its own lights, and ended with further important steps forward for the band. In fact, on the 26th, they performed on stage at the prestigious Olympia Theatre in Paris along with Van der Graaf Generator and Lindisfarne. The setlist was Watcher of the Skies, Twilight Alehouse, The Fountain of Salmachus, The Musical Box, The Knife. Then on the 28th, their old friend David Stopes decided to stage a special concert in Watford, a kind of Genesis convention for their most dedicated fans, accompanied by an advertising campaign in the press. There is a bootleg recording of this event revealing the usual technical problems and the following set list: Watcher of the Skies, Stagnation, One-Handed Drum Solo, The Fountain of Salmachus, Happy the Man, Twilight Alehouse, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, Instrumental Jam, The Knife. After 3 days of rehearsing in Blackheath, 3 to 5 July, Genesis made their debut in Holland, playing at the Paradiso in Amsterdam on the 7th and in Meerlo the following day at a festival with various artists, including Focus and Exception. They then had a few shows back home in the UK, the most important of which was the Midnight Chord at the Lyceum on the 24th, which began at midnight with performances from Capability Brown and Audience and closing with Genesis. Throughout this period and for the first half of August, the primary objective was to get the new album recorded. Nevertheless, the band still managed to put another feather in its cap by taking part in the famous Reading Festival on August 11th, albeit supporting better-known bands, Nazareth, Curved Air, Mungo Jerry, and with only a 40-minute slot. The set list was The Knife, Twilight Alehouse, Watcher of the Skies, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed. What is immediately striking is the decision to open with The Knife, obviously in an attempt to capture the attention of the crowd, who presumably knew very little about Genesis, with their heaviest track. After just a couple of days' break, it was time for their second tour in Italy, right in the middle of recording Foxtrot.
The first date of the tour was supposed to be on August 14th, in Rimini, but the second Italian tour, just like the one 4 months earlier, got off to a bad start. Thanks, we were traveling with Maurizio, Salvadori, and these two drivers, Sandro and Johnny, and a guy called Walter. They were basically friends of Maurizio who kind of liked us, while Richard McPhail had a van with all the gear in it. By the time we did those tours, we had a slightly bigger van, which only took the gear. The very first tour might have been with the transit van, but after that, we had a bigger one, a 3-tonner. When we played Rimini, Richard didn't turn up at all because he got stuck at the border. The gig had to be postponed, and some of the band members took consolation by joining the nocturnal jamming session, which used to be held at the Oltromondo discotheque. Here, Italian and foreign artists in the area would meet up after finishing their concerts. It was a period of great experimentation, and Lello Brandi, bass player with Italian band Osana, who together with Jumbo were openers for Genesis on some of their tour dates, distinctly remembers jamming with Collins on this occasion. Forced by circumstances to be tourists for a couple of days, it is said that they had a gig in Fano on 16 August, but there is a measure of doubt surrounding this. Genesis subsequently had a gig booked in Monsalis, 15 miles from Padua, for the 18th, but for some reason or another the venue, Dancing Lago del Rose, was not available and the gig had to be moved at the last minute to Feltri in the Belluno Dolomites. Flyers were used to inform fans of the change in plans, and they had to hastily make a journey of nearly 70 miles to reach the new venue. The concert took place, oddly enough, at a local sports ground, where Gabriel was clearly annoyed at the distance between himself and the audience, who were on the other side of a wire fence. Things didn't always go that badly, however, as most of the summer tour dates were indoors and usually in dance halls, such as the Dancing Jolie Club at Marina di Ravenna, normally used for ballroom dancing, where the band played on August 19th. The following day, the tour took them to the Versilia Riviera. Genesis arrived in Viareggio and played in the Piper Club 2000, which that summer had already hosted Rory Gallagher, Brian Auger, Atomic Rooster, and Van der Graaf Generator, as well as a number of Italy's best progressive rock bands. Genesis was closing this summer gig season and delighted the audience with a double concert, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. In the first, they played Watcher of the Skies, Can Utility and the Coastliners, The Fountain of Salmacus, Twilight Alehouse, Get 'Em Out by Friday, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, and The Knife. The bootleg recording of the evening show reveals the same setlist minus The Musical Box, but with a special treat for their Italian fans, a performance of Harold the Barrel as a second encore, practically the only time on the Nursery Crime tour it was ever played. Hackett, we did it a few times live, but we didn't think it really worked. It's a short song, another one of those miniatures in the middle of the epics. I was having this conversation with Roy Stolt, the guitarist with the Flower Kings and Transatlantic. He was saying it is much harder to write a short song than an epic. We'd written both, but it was much harder to write a short song that worked. The first date of the tour was supposed to be on August 14th, in Rimini, but the second Italian tour, just like the one 4 months earlier, got off to a bad start. Thanks, we were traveling with Maurizio, Salvadori, and these two drivers, Sandro and Johnny, and a guy called Walter. They were basically friends of Maurizio who kind of liked us, while Richard McPhail had a van with all the gear in it. By the time we did those tours, we had a slightly bigger van, which only took the gear. The very first tour might have been with the transit van, but after that, we had a bigger one, a 3-tonner. When we played Rimini, Richard didn't turn up at all because he got stuck at the border. The gig had to be postponed, and some of the band members took consolation by joining the nocturnal jamming session, which used to be held at the Oltromondo discotheque. Here, Italian and foreign artists in the area would meet up after finishing their concerts. It was a period of great experimentation, and Lello Brandi, bass player with Italian band Osana, who together with Jumbo were openers for Genesis on some of their tour dates, distinctly remembers jamming with Collins on this occasion. Forced by circumstances to be tourists for a couple of days, it is said that they had a gig in Fano on 16 August, but there is a measure of doubt surrounding this. Genesis subsequently had a gig booked in Monsalis, 15 miles from Padua, for the 18th, but for some reason or another the venue, Dancing Lago del Rose, was not available and the gig had to be moved at the last minute to Feltri in the Belluno Dolomites. Flyers were used to inform fans of the change in plans, and they had to hastily make a journey of nearly 70 miles to reach the new venue. The concert took place, oddly enough, at a local sports ground, where Gabriel was clearly annoyed at the distance between himself and the audience, who were on the other side of a wire fence. Things didn't always go that badly, however, as most of the summer tour dates were indoors and usually in dance halls, such as the Dancing Jolie Club at Marina di Ravenna, normally used for ballroom dancing, where the band played on August 19th. The following day, the tour took them to the Versilia Riviera. Genesis arrived in Viareggio and played in the Piper Club 2000, which that summer had already hosted Rory Gallagher, Brian Auger, Atomic Rooster, and Van der Graaf Generator, as well as a number of Italy's best progressive rock bands. Genesis was closing this summer gig season and delighted the audience with a double concert, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. In the first, they played Watcher of the Skies, Can Utility and the Coastliners, The Fountain of Salmacus, Twilight Alehouse, Get 'Em Out by Friday, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, and The Knife. The bootleg recording of the evening show reveals the same setlist minus The Musical Box, but with a special treat for their Italian fans, a performance of Harold the Barrel as a second encore, practically the only time on the Nursery Crime tour it was ever played. Hackett, we did it a few times live, but we didn't think it really worked. It's a short song, another one of those miniatures in the middle of the epics. I was having this conversation with Roy Stolt, the guitarist with the Flower Kings and Transatlantic. He was saying it is much harder to write a short song than an epic. We'd written both, but it was much harder to write a short song that worked.
At the time, we probably thought there was strength in length, but I'm speaking for myself, that's just my take on it. The setlist also included songs from Foxtrot, still to be released, and was already becoming quite impressive with Watcher of the Skies, Get 'Em Out by Friday and Can Utility and the Coastliners, at long last presented with its definitive title. In the meantime, songs such as Happy the Man and Going Out to Get You had been permanently dropped from the live shows. The band then moved on to the Liguria region, where they first played a gig in Albenga on the 21st, in what was pompously called a palasport, but which, in fact, turned out to be a Bulls Club, and then on the 22nd they played in the far more suitable Alcyon Theatre in Genoa. The setlist of the bootleg circulated amongst fans is Watcher of the Skies, Can Utility and the Coastliners, The Fountain of Salmacus, Twilight Alehouse, 7 Stones, The Musical Box / The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Yet another gift for the Italian audience. A unique, at least amongst the recordings which have survived, rendition of 7 Stones. I remember it sounding very good when we rehearsed it, says Hackett. There was a lot of reverb on the voice and on the piano accordion. The tour was supposed to wind up in Genoa, but they had to make up for the concert they'd had to cancel in Rimini on the 14th. So on August 23rd, Genesis played 2 concerts in the Adriatic tourist resort, both at the Locanda del Lupo. To celebrate the end of the tour, there was another jam session with Osanna, but this time way bigger than the previous one. Basically, the 2 bands merged with Hackett and Danilo Rusticai on guitars, Collins and Massimo Guarino on percussion, Elio Diana on sax, Lino Veretti on bass, and Gabriel on keyboards. It should also be pointed out that, at this time, Osanna, who were already famous in Italy thanks to albums like L'Uomo and the soundtrack to the film Milano Clibro 9, used to appear on stage wearing habits and heavily painted faces. Something which evidently did not go unnoticed by Gabriel,